Good evening. I'm Jody Pavlak, a professor in the history department here at the university, and I would like to welcome you all. This is a great turnout for the last week of the semester. I would like to welcome you all to tonight's presentation of the Presidential Lecture Series. As most of you know, this is a very special forum here at the university which contributes immensely to the intellectual life of the University of Montana and the Missoula community. The lecture series draws from very hard work from a number of people, foremost among whom is my colleague, Richard Drake, who's put enormous amount of time into this series, and we're very grateful for that. This series also would not be possible without the commitment of the university president, George Dennison, to whom I would like to convey enormous appreciation on behalf of myself and all of us who benefit so much from this series of lectures from leading specialists in cutting-edge fields. Tonight's lecture addresses a fascinating and salient topic in today's political world: the red wave in Latin America, what the turn to the left means for the United States. To present reflections on this topic, and I believe to raise some questions, serious questions about the formulation of the topic, we are extremely fortunate to have here with us one of the country's preeminent Latin Americanists, historian Kenneth Maxwell. Professor Maxwell comes to us most directly tonight from Harvard University, where he is currently a visiting professor of Latin American history and the director of the Brazilian Studies program at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Prior to holding these positions, Professor Maxwell served for 15 years, between 1989 to 2004, as the director of the Latin American program at the Council on Foreign Relations, this country's preeminent foreign policy think tank. During most of these years, from 1993 to 2004, Professor Maxwell was also the Western Hemisphere book reviewer for Foreign Affairs, the Council's highly influential journal, in which Professor Maxwell has published over 300 reviews. And beginning in 1995, Professor Maxwell became the first holder of the Nelson and David Rockefeller Chair in Inter-American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Through these years, Professor Maxwell has somehow found the time to also serve as a board member and advisor for numerous very critical institutions in both the United States and Brazil, including, among many others, the Tinker Foundation and Human Rights Watch Americas. Prior to teaching at Harvard, Professor Maxwell previously taught at Yale, Columbia, the University of Kansas, and Princeton, his alma mater, where he received his PhD in 1970 after receiving a BA and an MA from St. John's College at Cambridge University. Through his career as an historian, with great depth of research, creative insight, and beautiful writing, Kenneth Maxwell has produced an incredibly significant body of scholarly work over a wide range of subjects. His first book was published in 1973, only 3 years after he received his PhD. Entitled Conflicts and Conspiracies, Brazil and Portugal, 1750 to 1808, this brilliant monograph, as one reviewer notes, has long reigned as the premier treatment on the origins of Brazilian independence. It has no equal. Indeed, after being translated into Portuguese and republished many times, in 2004, Routledge released a new edition of this now classic work in Latin American history. Professor Maxwell then went on to publish several other highly acclaimed books about 18th century Brazil and Portugal, offering new understandings of what he termed the paradox of the Enlightenment as it developed in the Luso-American world. He also turned his scholarly acumen to more recent topics, including Portugal's struggles for democratization in the 1970s and 80s after the fall of the fascist Estado Novo, and Brazil's roughly concurrent transition to democracy, leading to the election of left-wing President Luiz Inácio da Silva, Lula, in October 2002. Professor Maxwell has also been a regular contributor to many newspapers and journals, including the New York Review of Books, World Policy Journal, and Folha de Sao Paulo. In short, the list of Professor Maxwell's acclaimed scholarly monographs, articles, essays, and chapters published in the United States, Brazil, and Portugal is far from short. In 2003, Routledge published a collection of 16 essays by Professor Maxwell under the title Naked Tropics, Essays on Empire and Other Rogues. Reviewing this work, New Yorker correspondent Alma Guillermo Prieto has written the following: an extraordinary collection of essays by an historian in love. Ken Maxwell explores the seductive mysteries of the tropics, and of Brazil in particular, with marvelous knowledge and a contagious passion. From the origins of chocolate to the legacy of empire to the tragic fate of a grassroots environmentalist, nothing escapes Maxwell's omnivorous attention, and nowhere does his beautiful, clear prose fail to delight. This book, Naked Tropics, is on sale from our bookstore if you're interested. As a newer Latin American historian, what most inspires me about Ken Maxwell's life work is his remarkable ability to move back and forth between realms of deep, serious, rigorous, intellectual, and scholarly inquiry, and the important worlds of public policy and administration. In his prolific writings, he is equally at ease tackling major historical questions and offering trenchant analyses of current affairs. It is by forging these bridges between the past and the present, and between erudite and public domains, that Professor Maxwell's life work offers a major contribution toward a future of greater global understanding and justice. We are extremely honored to have Professor Maxwell here with us this evening to discuss the extent and implications of the apparent turn to the political left in Latin America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kenneth Maxwell.
Well, thanks, Jody, very much for that very undeserved introduction. And of course, it always makes what comes afterwards an anticlimax. I hope not, but that's always the risk. Also, really delighted to be here and to thank President George Dennison for this marvelous series and for a marvelous dinner we had before. It's always also dangerous to eat before you speak because you tend to want to sleep. So I hope you don't sleep, or me. And also, of course, Professor Richard Drake, who invited me and persuaded me at some point when I was feeling overwhelmed with unfinished deadlines, which is always my problem. I think I create too many deadlines, and that's how you actually get something written, because you have to do it. But Richard persuaded me to come, and I'm delighted to be here. I also thought I should begin by truth in advertising. Try and be truthful in advertising, because in a sense, I just want to make 3 points before I get into the substance of what we're here to discuss tonight. The first point is that I think there is, before we get too gloomy, if we get gloomy about Latin America, it's easy to get gloomy. about Latin America, there is some good news. There is actually good news from Latin America if you think about Latin America in a comparative sense. You look at what's happening in the rest of the world, which is pretty horrible in most places. Latin America doesn't look so good, and I was listing some of the things that actually didn't look too bad. Democracy. There's actually democracy now in Latin America in every country, minus one, which is Cuba. Everywhere else has a democracy in the sort of traditional sense of the word, in terms of electoral politics and elected governments. That would not have been the case had we been standing here speaking 12 or 13 or 15 years ago, where you had horrendous military dictatorships ruling almost everywhere. That is no longer the case, so that's good news. There were also dirty wars going on in Latin America. We're only now learning the full extent of that. Not only in places we knew there were dirty wars, like Chile. Dirty wars, you mean internal wars, where large numbers of people are disappeared or murdered or tortured. 28,000 in the case of Chile, we now know. 38,000 or so in the case of Argentina. 200,000 or 300,000 in the case of Guatemala. More than we know, we don't know the number, even in Mexico, which we haven't known until recently the scale of the dirty war there. That isn't happening in general, so that's an important thing. There are no wars in the sense of wars like are going on in the Middle East in Latin America. There are no genocides taking place currently. There is actually very little terrorism of the type of terrorism, terrible car bombings and killings of people that we see daily in many parts of the world, including we've seen in London, don't forget, and to some degree we've seen elsewhere. But we don't see much of that in Latin America, which is something worth noting. We don't have coups any longer. So far, we have elections. Elections that some people see as coups, but nonetheless they bring in people into power they don't like. But that's not a coup, it's an expression of the public will. So that's another important point, I think, to make. I think also from the point of view of regions of the world where anti-Americanism, visceral anti-Americanism, which is a phenomenon that's much more acute now than it was, despite the rhetoric in Latin America, anti-Americanism very, very rarely affects individuals. Latin America is still a place where most Americans, students, professors, tourists, average people, can go and they can be welcomed. And that is another thing worth mentioning, because that is not true in some parts of the world where you can't go any longer and you can't interact on a daily basis with people as you still can in Latin America. So I think I just want to mention all those things at the beginning, because I think they're important points, what I would call still good news that takes place. The second truth in advertising point I want to make is that the title is really a question, the title of the lecture, what I want us to think about tonight. It's not a declaration, it's not a pontification, it's an invitation to think about it. And I think one of the most important things to do is not to simplify. I'm not trying to be simplistic or to create dichotomies. There are too many Manichaean dichotomies in the vision of the world today, that everything is black or white, you're for us or against it, you're red or you're blue, and so on. That isn't what I'm trying to say. Remember, one should always remember that life is complex. One knows life is complex in one's own life, and if one's own life is complex, the world is even more complex, and it's important to realize that. It reminds me very much of this marvelous senator, former senator, now departed from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who some of you may remember. It's a very odd and strange man to be a senator. I mean, occasionally in the American political system, somebody like Daniel Patrick Moynihan becomes a senator, and a powerful senator. From New York, he didn't actually do anything for New York at all. His counterpart at the time was Senator Alphonse D'Amato, who was known as the Pothole, the Senator Pothole. So you had a senator who actually did take care of constituents. Moynihan didn't. I know this because I had a student when I talked at Columbia who once was employed for the year after he graduated to work in Moynihan's New York office. And when he said, "Where is it?" he said, "Well, actually, there isn't a New York office." And he was the only person in it. It's incredible to think of a senator that actually didn't have an office in the major city of the state in which he represented. But he was this earthy person. And he would terrify people who came to his committees, when he was on committees, who gave him simple answers. Because he would always point to them, very powerful Irish presence, and he would point at them and saying, "Complexify, complexify." There's no word, there's no such word as complexify. But he would always terrify them by insisting, when they were being simplistic, that they actually explain that the situation was in its full complexity. So in a sense tonight, I want to complexify to some degree in what we're talking about. The third element is mortality. One has to remember, we're all mortal. I didn't like the idea of life's work. It makes me think, life's work is, I like the idea of life's work in a nice description, but in the sense that life ends. And we're confronting a very interesting mortality matter in Latin America at the moment, is that the two paradigmatic figures of Latin America that have had most international attention and exemplify in many ways the two extremes of Latin America, on the right and on the left, are both mortally ill at this moment. General Pinochet of Chile had a heart attack over the weekend and seems to be seriously ill, and Fidel Castro, the other permanent fixture for 50 years on the Latin American scene, also appears to be mortally ill. Did not appear at the great birthday celebration last week. He did not. A classic case of you don't appear at your own parade. He didn't appear at his own parade. And if they go, as they may well go, both of them, shortly, from the scene, that is a remarkable historical moment. That will certainly put Latin America back on the front pages, at least for the moment, because that shows the sort of end of a whole process on the right of military dictatorship, of forced marketization that Chile very much represented, and of course on the other side, the ending of a sort of Soviet style, if you like, socialist experiment close to the US. So I think we're at an interesting moment for that process. So what I wanted to talk about today was really a sense of how it is we think about Latin America, and therefore how it is we think about the left, the new left tide. Left, a wave. I was thinking a left tide, if you live on the coast, especially on the East Coast, and you hear about a red tide, you think of all sorts of nasty red fungi or whatever it is that comes on the beach and stops you from swimming, and I didn't necessarily want to create that image. But nonetheless, that image exists. It's a way of simplifying. It's a way not of complexifying the situation. So I think first I wanted to talk a bit about why is it this is the case that Latin America tends to get simplified in this way very often, and why? Why is Latin America important? Why does it matter? And it matters, I think, to us. I mean, we're here tonight talking about it, so we must have some degree of interest in the topic, but it is not self-evident that Latin America is important to the general American public, or to the majority of our colleagues in universities, for that matter, or to the press, or publishers. If you ever try and publish anything on Latin America, you know this is very difficult. And particularly if you want to publish something on Brazil, which is even worse. The publishers and the press don't think anybody out there is interested. And I was hit by this very early on in my career. I was very lucky in the early 70s, just before my first book was published, to spend several years at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. It was one of those marvelous good fortunes I had earlier on in my career. And the great figure there in history at the time was George Kennan, the famous George Kennan. And at the beginning of when you came in as a new person, as a new member of the Institute, there was a dinner where you met the senior fellows, the senior members there, and I happened to be sitting opposite George Kennan. and this was 1971, I think it was, and sitting next to me was a historian who now is a famous historian of France at the University of Chicago. And then this was 1971, had very long hair down to his hips somewhere. And he still does, actually. I mean, even now he still has long hair, he's lucky. And was wearing some sort of felt flower child thing. And sitting next to me, and George Kennan was sitting opposite. And George Kennan, you have to remember at this moment, was very offended by what was going on in universities, and very offended by student power. And I think he looked at us across the table and he thought, I could see it in his eyes, he thought, oh God, student power, hippiedom or whatever it is, has come to the Institute for Advanced Study. And the dinner went on, he didn't speak to us, he just looked at us. And but towards the end he said to us, well, what are you doing? What are you doing here? And a colleague who was William Sewell, who's a fairly famous historian of France now, said, well, I'm studying France. So that seemed to placate George Kennan. He thought that sounded respectable, was to study France. And then he asked me what I was doing, and I foolishly said, well, I'm interested in Latin America. That's what I'm here to do. And then there was a deadly silence, absolute silence from George Kennan, who looked at me he was a man who had brilliant blue eyes, and I can still see them, these brilliant blue eyes looking at me in silence, and it seemed like an hour, it was probably, I don't know, 3 minutes or something. And he said to me, but don't you agree that no history occurred outside the Rhine Valley? And I thought, well, I mean, where do you go from that? So I tried to explain that actually there were a few things that were important, but it was the attitude. I mean, why I'm saying this is it's a classic summary of the attitude that Latin America is not serious. It's beyond serious, and it's the old bromide that Americans will do anything for Latin America, but read about it or think about it. And this shows up in the press, the U.S. press, which is very perfunctory in its coverage. The news, if you look at it and analyze it, when it comes out, tends to be in specialized sections of the newspapers. The financial sections will cover Latin America in a reasonable way because it matters. There is debt, there's money to be made, so you have to have accurate stories. But in the political side, there's very, very little that's not folkloric, and it's there if the space allows. And the telltale sign of this is if you look at coverage of Latin America, and I'm talking about the major mainstream, Washington Post, New York Times, and so on, there's a telltale thing that always shows up. There is no dateline. There is no timeline. So if you notice that, you realize these stories have been sitting around and it doesn't matter when they appear. It's when space is there and they need a nice story that shows that Brazilians like to dance carnival, that there's whatever it is. I mean, it tends to be a folkloric story. And I think this is not just prejudice, it's not just ignorance. And that's only part of the story. And if you think of it, a lot of the leading journalists today in the US actually made their careers in the 1980s in Central America. It's not as though they don't know. Many of the very most famous American journalists today, editors, senior correspondents, columnists, were active as journalists in the 1980s in Central America during the Contra Wars and all this. So it's not as though they don't know it. So I think there are other explanations for it. And it is certainly not true about the government. The government pays a lot of attention to Latin America. And my colleague at Harvard, John Coates, did a recent analysis of U.S. intervention in Latin America between 1898 and 1994. And he calculated this as in terms of direct and indirect intervention. And he found this is the area that nobody pays attention to. That the U.S. government, he calculated, intervened in Latin America once in every 28 months in the period between 1898 and 1994. Every 28 months. He lists 41 interventions, direct and indirect. Now, it's worth remembering this because most of these were characterized by what? Unilateralism, as well as by the rhetoric of what else? Democracy building. Unilateralism, democracy building. Now, haven't we heard this recently? Wouldn't it have been useful if there'd been a little bit of attention to the not very successful results of that unilateral and democracy building in Latin America over the last period between 1898 and 1994? Nonetheless, that's exactly what's going on now with respect to Cuba. And this is not an issue that could not hit us next week or within the next month or so. And to some degree to do with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. So what did we have recently? We had Dr. Rice and President Bush recently proposed to the OAS, the Organization of American States, a mechanism, they called it, to monitor democratic practices in the region. This is a region which is all democratic, all has elections, except Cuba. The problem is not democracy, it is that democracy is producing leaders that Washington or Dr. Rice and Mr. Bush don't like. So is there no historical memory about mechanisms before? Let me quote one. This is a quote. This is a mechanism to do with democracy. Quote, to maintain a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. Not, you notice, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but life, property, and individual liberty. This was Article number 3 of the Platt Amendment that gave the US the right to intervene in Cuba. So, not surprisingly, no one in Latin America, no one at the OAS supported this proposal. Every one of them opposed it. So the question to me is, why is there this odd disjunction between what the US speaks and how it acts in Latin America? And let me look at one very exemplary example, what I call the case of Mr. X and the case of Mr. Y. And this involves two paradigmatic individuals as well, Dean Acheson and, again, George Kennan. Both, if you remember, in the famous phrase, present at the creation of the world system, as it has been in many ways until the end of the Soviet Union after the Second World War, the international system. And this involves the story of two long telegrams. Now, we know, of course, one of these long telegrams, everybody knows, is the origin of the containment policy towards the Soviet Union. This is the long telegram George Kennan wrote and which formed the basis of US policy in many ways with respect to the Soviet Union and the Soviet expansionism in the immediate post-World War period, 1947 onwards, until the end of the Soviet Union in '89. But there was another long telegram, and this was written by George Kennan, and it was written from where? Latin America, about Latin America. The irony is that it was too strong even for Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson found this telegram from George Kennan so inflammatory that he locked away his copy in the safe at the State Department, and he had all the other copies destroyed. And the only reason that we know about it is that when he left the State Department, he forgot that this copy was in his safe, and it was later discovered, and it is now available in the edition of the Foreign Relations of the United States that is published, which has the full text of this George Kennan long telegram from Latin America. What did it say? Well, he hated Latin America. He absolutely hated it. And his comments are really too strong to cite, even here, I think. To summarize it, Kennan essentially saw Latin America as what he called the product of a dead civilization. And let me quote just one extract from it. This is George Kennan's long telegram on Latin America. It seems to me, this is George Kennan, unlikely that there could be any other region of the earth in which nature and human behavior have combined to produce a more unhappy and hopeless background for the conduct of human life than in Latin America. And the rest of the telegram was basically explaining why that was the case. He argued, interestingly, in the context of the growing global struggle between the Soviet Union and the US, between communism and the free world, he argued that democracy would not achieve success in this, what he regarded as barren and inhospitable ground. And he argued not for containment, as he'd argued to do with the Soviet Empire, but the need for what he called quiet intervention. And he recommended that the US brace itself, his words, to deal with some rather unpleasant characters to achieve its aims and protect its interest. Not the sort of people George Kennan would want to invite to have dinner with him at Princeton. That's certainly true. Now, all this was far too much for Dean Acheson. As I say, he ordered it destroyed, the document locked in his safe. And that is where it remained. Curiously, that unlike the famous Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs, which was a popularization of the long telegram to do with the Soviet Union, Foreign Affairs did in fact publish an article on Latin America by a Mr. Y. If you go back and look at the edition of 1950, you'll see an article by a Mr. Y, which shows you how important in the balance Latin America was regarded in this period. But they didn't use George Kennan because it was too inflammatory. They got some minor functionary at the State Department that everybody's forgotten about now to write this article. And it was called, the article was called Impatient with the Failures of Latin America to Achieve More Political Democracy. The US needed to behave like a stern father, is the words, who was reacting with sort of upset at the way in which, after his children had publicly embarrassed him by misbehaving. I mean, if there was ever a more paternalistic attitude towards neighbors, it was expressed in this article in Foreign Affairs. But the irony, of course, is that this was not the policy that was actually implemented. It was actually George Kennan's policy that was implemented, which was one of quiet interventions, what I would call the Cold War by delegation. And the result was Guatemala. Guatemala was the only area in Latin America where George Kennan thought there was a serious communist threat. He so regarded Latin Americans as incapable of anything that they were also incapable of being communists. This was one of his arguments. So you didn't really even have to take that seriously except Guatemala, and we know what the consequences of that were. They were the unpleasant collaborators that he said we had to deal with. So the point of all this is I think it's important to stress that this is not just attacking or criticizing Kennan or Acheson and so on. What it is showing is this complete disconnect between reality and rhetoric in how the US has traditionally dealt with Latin America. In other words, it says it's very important, but it acts in this clandestine way. This is what I would call the Mr. X and the Mr. Y syndrome. Now, the second general point about looking at the region is that we have to look at our own house, in other words, our own academic house. And I think one of the things I certainly noticed very much in my role at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I notice it even more returning to academic life, is this tremendous gap, the great gap between academic discourse and policy. So it's all very well for us to criticize the politicians and the State Department and so on, but it is not as though we provide any critique or any alternative view that is expressed in a manner that is intelligible to them. And I think this is true not just of policymakers within the government. This is very true with how academics speak to congressmen or to speak to other people who are involved in the policy debate. And I think this is a point worth saying, that we're all to some degree to fault on this. The U.S. Academy in many ways has fled reality for intellectual and cultural constructs, magical and reductionist analysis, or narrow statistical constructs, which reinforce, it seems to me, this inability in many ways of the academy to speak to these major policy issues. Now, thirdly, I think we have to recognize that there are major costs to the US and dangers that flow out of these disconnections, and they have been aggravated, in my view, very much by post 9/11, and also now by the wars, continuing wars in Iraq and the continued conflicts in the Middle East. Why is this the case? I think it's the case that because in this period, since 9/11, while the US, for all sorts of legitimate reasons, Nobody can say there is not a legitimate reason to be worried post 9/11 about homeland security and about all these issues. That is not the point. The point is that while the US has been focused away on these issues, I think what I'd call tectonic shifts have been taking place in the Western Hemisphere, very much in Latin America, which has had the effect of fragmenting and diversifying the region, which is still perceived in Washington, I'm talking particularly about Washington's view here, as a undiversified region. In other words, Washington still talks and thinks about Latin America, whereas in fact now there are, at least in my view, 3 Latin Americas that need to be considered to make effective policy, to make effective reactions to what's going on. And we've seen 2 indications recently of the way the US has completely misread the forces at play in the region in 2 cases. One was the election to the UN, the dispute that took place between Venezuela and Guatemala, where you had, in a sense, caricatures on both sides of a position, on the Chavez side and on the Guatemala side, which led to an impasse, and you had somebody else, the US candidate, that was not the US candidate, elected. Eventually, the same was true with the OAS. The OAS has been a rubber-stamped operation ever since its foundation. What the US wanted, the US got. That was what the OAS was all about, until recently. The US did not get the Secretary General of the OAS. I mean, if the US can't get that in its own area, bailiwick, then it's something is serious wrong about the way in which the US is perceiving and acting in the region. So that again, the wrong candidate, or a candidate that would not receive the support of Latin America, was supported, and in the end a compromise candidate came forward that had not been the candidate the US wanted. These are just small indications of a complete misreading in Washington of how the region is diversified now. What I mean by the 3 Latin Americas is, in a sense, just to put it in very schematic terms, is that there is a North American region that has emerged. And I don't just mean post-NAFTA, I don't just mean integration at the top. There has been integration at the top, trade, financial flows, principally, that have taken place in the NAFTA, post-NAFTA period. But it's much broader than that. There is this whole notion, Thomas Friedman, the notion of the flat earth, because of technologies, because of internet, because of all the developments that are taking place in the globalization that's happening in the world. But the point is, it's a flat earth, but the flat earth has basements, which also interconnect, and the basements have sub-basements that interconnect. So the integration is not just going on at the top level, it's going on through illegal migration, it's going on through the remittances that go back, it's going on through the narco-trafficking, it's going on through positive and negative ways within the North American region. And was talking here, Mexico, the Greater Caribbean to some degree, North and South America, which are all part, for better or worse now, of a deepening. It's not just a flattening, it's a deepening of connections within the North American region, which are much more integrated. So the trade of Mexico is now 99% or so with the US. Canada always has been, true with the Caribbean. And as I say, a lot of this doesn't necessarily show up in official statistics, because one's dealing here with an underground economy, people moving back and forward, undocumented people are only a fraction of this that we're talking about. But this is the deepening of the North American circumstance. In South America, the opposite is happening. In other words, the trade and financial flows and people are flowing into the North American area, deepening it. The opposite is happening in South America. The trade and connections of the biggest countries in South America are now completely globalized and diversified. If you look at Brazil, if you look at Mexico, if you look at Brazil, if you look at Argentina, if you look at Chile, beginning to be with Peru, to some degree with Ecuador, their trade and commercial and financial relationships now, and their increasing political relationships, are now, I would say, a third Europe, a third Asia, very, very important rise of Asia, particularly China in this equation, and a third to the US. So the US is actually a smaller part of the picture. So you're getting a opposite trend taking place in South America that is diversifying, opening up these big South American countries outside Latin America. So they no longer think of themselves at all as part of some unified Western Hemisphere area. And then the third, Latin America, is the Andes, this incredible ferment that's taking of consciousness of these are incredibly unequal societies. As you know, these are societies which have not really extended the benefits of modernization or the economy or growth to the majority of the population. You have hundreds of thousands and millions of people living with less than $2 a day throughout the Andes who are indigenous people or are people with very strong indigenous elements in their ethnic makeup. And one of the most incredible revolutions that's taking place with unpredictable consequences is the coming to consciousness of this repressed group that had been excluded and dominated by small Europeanized elites in most cases for, let us remember, almost 500 years. So the fact that you get an indigenous person elected into the presidency of Bolivia, which has the largest indigenous population in proportionality outside, say, Guatemala, is a huge revolution and an unpredictable revolution. And the logic and the rhetoric and the thought patterns that go on are not within the logic of the market or of the way that we've dealt with and thought about Latin America in recent times. I think this is one of those tectonic shifts and changes that's going on that one needs to be aware of. So I think this has been missed. I think one of the elements of thinking monolithically about the region is to miss these profound shifts and changes that are taking place that affect policy, affect the way bureaucracies are organized, affect the way actually university departments to some degree, the way we think about Latin America is shifting and changing in a complex manner. Now, secondly, why is this dangerous? I think it's also dangerous because it means, for all the reasons I talked about this at the beginning, the disjunction between perception and reality, and the Mr. X and the Mr. Y syndrome, is that crises happen. I mean, there is this whole notion that, and this is particularly true in the attitude towards Cuba at the moment, that in fact everything will sort of go on. Castro will go, but Raul will take over and whatever. I don't think that's the case. I really don't think one should, certainly in any prediction of the future, assume that to be the case, particularly when one is locked into a policy without mobility. The US is locked statutory constraints are on what the President of the United States can do, even if he wanted to do it. And that is hugely dangerous. The whole notion of, it's one of those incredible things that happened under the pressure mainly of the Cuban American lobby. So there is a tremendous potential problem there, seems to me, in that when a dictatorship, or when a highly personalized dictatorship, as Cuba is, ends, there will be a calm. But then, once he's gone, he's gone. The world is different. And if you're locked into a policy that you can't respond to this, it strikes me that that's a dangerous thing. The other thing is that who do you ask when a crisis occurs? One of the most striking things is the lack of this consistent coverage, even in the main newspapers, even in the opinion. Any serious coverage of politics, of the sinews of politics, the type of thing that you would talk about endlessly if you were discussing a US election, in the minutiae, or predicting who will be the new candidates, or the Democrats or the Republicans for the next presidential campaign. There is nothing in the coverage of Latin America that allows you to know or define who candidates are. There is no serious discussion of politics, and there's the notion that nobody's interested. Well, maybe they are. Maybe when a crisis occurs, it would be interesting actually to know who was who. And the problem is then you call the same 3 or 4 people. The irony to me is that when Washington has good correspondence in Latin America, Washington Post or New York Times, just to take 2 examples, and they know damn well what's going on because they're there, what do? They call up somebody in a think tank in Washington for a quote to put in to confirm what it is they're arguing. And I think this gets us a very long way of getting back to the issue of the red tide. Because if you call think tanks in Washington, who are locked into the syndrome that I'm talking about, they would tend to confirm the simplistic view of what's going on. And the reader, if this was told him about American politics, would know, you're not going to be told there's a red or whatever tide it is, if in your own local politics you have your own informed opinion about your representatives. There was a classic case in Brazil in the leading up to the election of Lula in the first term. It almost sank Brazil. It caused a huge financial crisis because everybody thought then that Lula was the bad left. There's been a serious discussions lately about a good left and a bad left. A good left is relatively moderate. It's relatively friendly to the market. It's relatively friendly to the US. The bad left is a more sort of socialist, structuralist, anti-American, populist left. Lula, 4 years ago, was very much in the category of first run for president and the bad left. A month ago, Lula was very much in the good left. He moved. And the same people who were arguing about the axis of evil in Latin America 4 years ago, which was Lula, Castro, Chavez, were arguing that the good left, that was Lula, Bachelet in Chile, and goodness knows Mr. Garcia, who's just been re-elected in Peru, who was one of the most corrupt and incompetent populist politicians of the last half century in Peru, reinvented himself as somebody of the good left, because there was an even nastier left running, who was actually not a left, he was probably a fascist, if you read anything about this man's policies. But anyway, that's for passing. So it's dangerous, I think, this dangerous simplification of what goes on, the calling of 2 or 3 people who will make results. And the Lula case was particularly interesting because a leading analyst, one of the people who was always called by Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, New York Times, Washington Post, invented what he called the Lulometer. The Lulometer was a graph which went bad or good depending on the price of the C bond. The C bond is the major debt instrument that would rise in risk or fall in risk according to the perception of the leftness or the danger of the government of Lula. So the Lulometer, was going up to 300 or 400% or something or other. And the reality was that Lula, when he came into power, what did he do? The first thing he did was implement the most orthodox policy, financial policy in Latin America, a policy that shocked. It was the shock policy. It wasn't the shock policy that usually is implemented. It was the shock policy that shocked reality into Wall Street. Wall Street realized, Brazil's a big economy. We have billions of dollars at stake. This man is not crazy. This man is a union leader. He wants the system to work. He wants to bargain. He wants to raise the income level of his supporters. So something that should have been obvious before, had anybody asked anybody in Brazil who actually knew Lula, they didn't. They asked the guy on Wall Street who created the Lulometer, and almost sank not only Brazil, but also might have had a serious effect on several of the major banks who had debt out in Latin America. So the reason I think we're discussing a left trend is to some degree that Latin America in the last year has had multiple elections. And these have produced different results across the spectrum. And I think if you look from the south to the north, you have a whole series of different patterns. From Chile, you have an elected president who is very much a social democrat, who is not really changing or upsetting the pattern of economic policy in Chile. Interestingly enough, a colleague of mine is the finance minister now, who came from the Socialist Party, but in fact had been the chief of staff of the former finance minister who had come from the Christian Democratic Party, and they had exactly the same policy. So I wouldn't consider that a shift or a move in any real sense. In Argentina, you have a government that is Peronist. How do you define Peronists? The Peronists are whatever they want to be to win elections. They're left one year, they're right one year, they split, they fight, they're corrupt. They're a boss. They're a boss system. The only other place that has a system like that is Boston, actually. I think Boston has. My experience of the Big Dig and all this stuff makes me think that well, anyway. So it's a boss-run system in Argentina. Populist when they have the money, boss and violent when they don't, and they need to keep power. Brazil, you have a very middle road government. You have a government that's left, in theory, but is very much center-left, pursuing economic policies that are pleasing to not only the banking sector, who've made a huge amount of money, but also have provided real benefits to the population. There has been a very important beginning of a shift that is beginning to change that huge gap that exists between rich and poor. It's begun to happen. It hasn't happened in 500 years. It certainly hasn't happened in the last 50 years, when Brazil had very high rates of growth. You're beginning to get rates of growth and a shift in the distribution of income, which is very important. Chile, I should mention, has had dramatic impact on poverty levels over the last decade. It's halved in the last decade. These are real shifts and changes. You have Bolivia, where I say you've had a revolution, there's no question about it. But I think the indigenous element to it is more important perhaps than the rhetoric of it. And I think it's less predictable for that reason. I don't think it's a good or a bad thing. I'm not making a judgment. I'm just saying it's probably much more difficult to deal with as an indigenous movement with all these incredible 500 years of accumulated resentments that exist. So it's not easy to classify it, and it's certainly not easy to deal with thinking that somehow it's a creature or a creation of money from Venezuela. That is a huge error. It is much more serious, much more difficult to deal with than that, and it has to be taken seriously in terms of its own right. You have to really take seriously what people say, listen to them, see what it is going on. You've had, as I say, in Peru, you've had a president who was an old populist, reformed as a type of centrist, market-oriented person. We'll see how it works out. I can't really see that Garcia suddenly becomes a Bachelet or on the model of a modern mind. We'll see. You've had a fairly young economist of the left elected in Ecuador. And another problem with Ecuador is not the rhetoric of the president, it's an incredibly unstable polity. So for any president, whoever he comes from, left or right, is going to have great difficulty in ruling. You have in Colombia a populist of the right, very pro-American, but in terms of the way he behaves and connects and deals with the assembly, is very much a populist in many ways, but of the right. In Venezuela, you have, I don't think, a new left. You have an old caudillo sitting on an oil well. That's what you have. He's a caudillo of a typical type. He's invented this idea of a Bolivarian revolution. Bolivar was a suppressor of the very people that he claims to represent. Bolivar wanted to repress the indigenous population of Bolivia. That's named after him. That's the historical reality of the situation. It's essentially a petro-state. The way to think of Venezuela, I think, is not in the Latin American context, but maybe like a Nigeria or like a Saudi Arabia or like Iran or Iraq, a country that has huge difficulties dealing with wealth without a highly structured economy to absorb it. So you have enormous corruption, you have enormous disorganization, but you have money that can buy people off. The money in the hands of the Venezuelan government has gone up 5-fold in the last 2 years. And why is that? It's because the US is fighting a war, I'm putting it in crude sense, but the fact that there's a war in the Middle East and in Iraq, that oil and petroleum supplies have been disrupted, that prices have gone up, is at least half of the explanation of Chavez. Because Chavez has money to spend on Cuban doctors, money to buy down debt for his pals, money to intervene in political campaigns, and so on. The key question is that sustainable? Once the money dries up, once the wars are resolved, once petroleum prices come down, then the party is over, I think. I don't see that. And then you have, of course, the situation in Cuba. So I think if you look at that whole pattern, it is not easily wrapped into one pattern, but is nonetheless extremely challenging. Because I think what it shows in general is that in the end, you can't really sustain forever states that are that unequal in terms. Latin America is the most unequal area in the world. It has the most social exclusion. It has the continuous failures of magic solutions, be they of the market, be they of the left, to resolve these problems. So the problem is more of the institutions, the sinews, management, the consistency of policy, than it is, I think, of these, what I would call, once again, magical solutions. And Brazil, in this context, is quite an interesting case. Because Brazil really is in the middle. And Brazil is the biggest. And Brazil is the most modern economy and has the largest financial sector. And is the country that is most globalized now in terms of its international connections. So that is the country to watch. I think it'd be extremely interesting to see how Lula 2, the second term of Lula, goes. So is there hope in all this, where we came in? And I think there is. I think I get a sense that maybe for the wrong reasons, that the notion of unilateralism, the notion that the world is simple and can be resolved, that democracies can emerge on infertile ground, that all these things take thought, preparation, consistency, analysis of what's going on, is beginning to show, hopefully. And certainly in the universities, you're getting more attention to the region. Students who go back and forward. I mean, I think there's an enormous revolution in the number of students who go and spend semesters in Latin America, and Latin American students that come here. That's a hugely important thing. It's very difficult if you actually live in and see a place to fall for simple explanations. Because you know, you see, you know the people, you talk to them. I know this is a long-term hope, but I think that is happening. There is an internationalization of the American university system that's very powerful, and I think will have an important, a long-term impact. So how do we connect the dots in all this? And I just got recently this, I have a terrible habit of buying things I shouldn't buy, like books and manuscripts and things like this. And I came across this letters that had been written from Bahia in Brazil. Bahia was the vice regal capital of Brazil. This was in the mid-17th century. It was in 1634. And it was when the Dutch were trying to seize the capital of Brazil during the period of their greatest expansion. And they wanted Brazil for two reasons. Brazil was sugar. Brazil dominated the sugar markets in Europe. And Brazil and the Portuguese also dominated the slave exporting areas in Africa. So the Dutch attacked Bahia and they attacked Angola at the same time. So this was a soldier. We don't know whether he was Dutch or Portuguese, but he was describing in a letter back home this Dutch attempt to take Salvador to Bahia in 1624. I should mention 1624. This is 12 years before the founding of Harvard University. Brazil is an old country. Bahia had been the capital of Brazil for 100 years before 1624. And this is written like a reporter's notebook. And he said this at the beginning. As I say, it's almost like a blow-by-blow account of how the city was being besieged. And he said, I decided to write down, without love or hate, in order that the truth be known and the influence of the human element in great undertakings be registered. Sem amor e sem ódio, in Portuguese, without love or hate. Now, we all like to think of ourselves as being original, especially professors always like to think of themselves as being original. But I had a memory. I was forced to still in my time at school in England, we had endless Latin lessons. And I vaguely remembered having been forced to read Tacitus, and I went to look. And in Tacitus Annals 1:1, which was in the 1st century, I was right. There was exactly the same sentiment. He said he wanted to write the history sine ira et studio, without hate and without love. So perhaps there is one answer. Perhaps if we can think of that as the way we look at the world, and we certainly look at Latin America, maybe we can avoid the Mr. X and the Mr. Y syndrome, and also the Wall Street lulometer. So there is hope. So thanks very much.
Professor Maxwell will now field questions or comments. We just ask you to come up to the microphone, if you would, and introduce yourself and present your question or comment. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for your presentation. Appreciate it. You discussed about 3 major tectonic shifts going on, and we know that Mexico has significant integration with the United States, and that South America is expanding laterally, globally, and not necessarily that kind of unilateral relationship that has happened before with the United States. But I wonder if you could talk about Central America, in how some of its indigenous influences are there, some of the things that are going on recently with the recent election with Daniel Ortega, and some of the autonomous zones in Nicaragua, and what's also with some of the manufacturing distribution that's taking place in some of the narcotraficante, the transshipment of narcotics that are also going through the region. So I didn't know if you had any comments about policy, things to look for in Central America. Maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I was actually, it's interesting, I mean, 2 just sort of general points. I mean, it's interesting how the election of Daniel Ortega has sort of disappeared. I mean, you would have thought there would have been more reaction to the reemergence of Daniel Ortega, but of course he reemerges at a very different ideological framework than before. It's a very good point about, it's very curious when you think back to the 1980s how central Central America had become to US thinking about the region because of the Contra Wars and Ortega Sandinista Revolution and all these matters. The same is true of the Caribbean, beyond Cuba. I mean, it's one of the great mysteries is how you actually produce viable economies that don't float on remittances. I mean, the role of remittances in all those countries, El Salvador is particularly high. I think it's like 40% of gross domestic product now are remittances from the U.S., from El Salvadorians who are here in the U.S. The level we don't know, but it's probably not that high, but it's certainly a critical element in the gross domestic product of all the Central American countries. Much greater to a degree than any of the larger countries in South America, but similar to the Caribbean, where this is also true. It's also incidentally true of Puerto Rico if you take into remittances in terms of Social Security payments and these sort of elements. So there's some similarity there. So access to market here is important. And as you know, that's a complicated political issue because all politics are local when it comes down to how Congresses act. And I thought one of my marvelous experiences of coming to Montana and listening to the news last night was this great phrase of Senator Baucus, who was meeting with the South Koreans for the free trade deal. And it's one of these classic phrases, no deal, no beef. If no beef, no deal. And I thought that just summed up everything about the way these trade negotiations go on, because that's the way, in the end, this sort of bargaining has to happen. Small countries don't have a great deal of clout, and a huge amount of energy was expended in getting CAFTA and all the deals that happened through the current deals that are going on that may or may not go through Congress, to do with North and South America, with Colombia, so deals with Ecuador and so on, are very problematic. The whole trade thing has fallen apart in many ways. So that again is one of the problems. It's a problem of economic development, of growth, of self-sustaining growth that doesn't rely on de facto accepting that you're going to export a large proportion of your own population. That is the irony of NAFTA. I mean, the irony of NAFTA, and again, I was talking about this afternoon. I was at a meeting on Saturday on Mexico, and it was said, both from the US side and from the Mexican side, privately, not for public, none of these things would be said publicly, but the estimates are that 500 or 600,000 Mexicans will enter the US per year in the next decade. I mean, that is what the governments think. And that is, so walls and whatever will have no effect on that, because the push factor is because Mexico does not have the economic development plans or the rural development plans to keep population. So calculated in their economic policy is the fact that 500,000 people will leave. There's no way to absorb them into the economy. And the same, I think, is true in many of the Central American cases. And that's why I'm saying is this, there has to be thought given to the way all these things interact. And the fact that some are formal, part of the formal economy, some are hidden. They're part of a system that is forcing this, for better or worse, this integration in North America. And at some point, it's going to have to come to terms with this. It may come through the political system. Eventually, people will vote, not tomorrow, but maybe in 10, 15, 20 years' time. California, already, I think it's the majority of the population is non-Anglo, so this will have a major impact in the long term. But, these are some of the changes. They're dramatic changes for the whole nature of the way society functions and sees itself. And the US isn't isolated from it, it's part of it. So there's a long way of answering the question there, because I think it's wrapped up in this much more complex picture that's going on. And a small country in these tectonic changes has increasingly little power to influence it, I think. That's part of the problem.
Hi, my name is Raquel. I'm actually from Brazil, and I want to thank you for the lecture. I enjoyed it very much, but I have some comments about obviously Brazil, and I wanted maybe your feedback or something. You said that Lula is a union guy, and he might be, the translation for his job might be that, for his career might be that, but in English, but in Portuguese, being syndicalista, he's actually not really much interested in bargaining or the health of the whole country as a whole economic environment, from the lowest employer to the richest employer, kind of guy. He's actually more interested in, his history is of being a guy that engineers strikes to try not to negotiate and to bargain, but to just force the issue and to force the employers to give him whatever he's looking for. He's actually started his career cutting his own finger to be able to stay at home and get health insurance from the company so he wouldn't have to work. So he's not really interested. His history is not one of bargaining, but of just pushing the envelope until as far as it can go, so he could get as much as he wants or he's interested in. And when you said that Brazil is starting to close the gap of the distribution of income and talking about the economic power of Brazil and everything, there is a very dangerous, this coming year will be a very dangerous year for Brazil, because for the past 4 years that Lula has been in the government, he has been reaping the benefits from the previous president, former president from Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. And he hasn't been making any investment. Actually, he's against any import from other countries, especially the U.S. So he has been just following, especially because it's true that he said that it was very surprising that he stayed with the orthodox policies from the previous government, which was a very smart decision from whoever was really running the country, because I don't believe Lula was ever running the country. He doesn't have the ability to run the country with his education only until 11 years old and just a career of strikes. So whoever decided to continue the economic policies from Fernando Henrique Cardoso really was very smart and could keep Lula in place for 4 years, which was ultimately, I believe, the goal, just to get 8 years into elections, in terms. So my point is, it's a very dangerous year for Brazil this next year, because all the investments and all the structure that Fernando Henrique has put forth in Brazil and the international name that Fernando Henrique Cardoso put outside Brazil with his struggles and with his connections, now are losing effect after 4 years with Lula, and after 4 years without any different, significant difference in the situation of the country. Now the new year will be very hard for especially the lower class. One example is the amount of scholarships that have been being requested by students. I know people that work with scholarships, and they have been, instead of working with 1 month of interviews of the people, they have been just finishing the interviews now. So the amount of people that don't have money to go to college has risen very significantly. So that's just a comment on that.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is very much what the opposition said in the last election. I mean, that's very much what Alckmin argued. It very much represents the Tucano or the Fernando Henrique position. But it lost. It lost the election. Now, the interesting thing is that what you said perfectly summarizes the critique from that part of the political spectrum. My role as an analyst is to look at both and make a judgment about it. And I think my interpretation is that there's the positive results that you see in Brazil are precisely a result of continuity. Whatever the rhetoric between the Fernando Henrique period and the Lula period in some particular important areas, that is in the control of inflation, which I think has been extremely important. It was consistent through both administrations. And that has had very positive effect in terms of those people who earn cash, the people who are in the informal economy or at the lower levels of the economy. Because as you know, one of the enormous fears of people, having faced a period of hyperinflation until the real, the current currency, which is a stable currency supported by both the previous government and this government, is sustained by it. Brazil had faced thousands of percent inflation, and if you're a earning cash and you're facing that and you get the cash at the beginning of the week, it is worth 20% or 15% of its value at the end of the week. Now that did not affect, by and large, the salary earners, professors and so on, who had indexed salaries. And it didn't particularly affect those that had were investing in government bonds of one sort or another, which were also indexed. So the upper classes in Brazil were not affected in the same way by inflation as the working and lower classes and the informal sector. And that has been sustained, and I think that is one of the benefits. Now, the Bolsa Familia, obviously, also this was an assistance program that was invented under a different term by Fernando Henrique, but was developed and expanded and extended by Lula's government. It has also had a very positive effect if you look at the statistics in terms of families staying in school, and food and purchasing by families, and those families saw that and voted that. The irony, in my view, and I've argued this, I mean, there's a big debate going on that I got involved in on this issue, that the problem with the Tucano, with the opposition, with Alckmin, the opposition to Lula, is that when it came down to defending, some of the specific acts of the previous government, which were market-oriented reforms like privatizations, for example, which were one of the major efforts that took place under the previous government, the candidate would not defend them, and was defensive about them. And part of the problem in Brazil, therefore, was this lack of clear definition as to what a center-right party, which in effect, in my view, practically speaking, the Tucano is. They like to think of themselves as being social democratic. And Serra, who was the candidate, was far to the left. So that is part of the problem. So I think it's a question of clarity of expressing things. The other two things that you didn't mention that came into the campaign, which I think were very important: public security, that is the day-to-day security of people in their homes, on the street, is enormously under threat in Brazil because of the huge extent of narco trafficking, the fact that large areas of the slums are in the hands of gangs, and that didn't come into that was probably the third, I think, on the polling. That's the third item that worries Brazilians. Never was discussed in the campaign, ever. And the reason was the candidate, your candidate, was the governor of Sao Paulo, where this big thing happened and didn't want to deal with. Lula, for obvious reasons, didn't want to deal with it as well. So I think that was the problem. It was very odd. And the second thing was corruption, because the scale of corruption, and this is a problem throughout Latin America, and in many ways it's a problem globally, because a lot of this corruption is related to the huge expense of campaigning, of political campaigning. This is one of the downsides of democracy. You have elections, you have all these things, you have to pay for them. It costs more to run an election in Brazil than in the US, because they're statewide constituencies. So you can imagine the expense of campaigning, of advertising, and the rest of it. That is where the corruption initially came in, both in the Tucano area and in the Lula area. And it's not that Lula or Fernando Henrique were putting money into their pockets. There's no indication that one has seen that either are corrupt people, but surrounding them were corrupt people, and often there were corrupt people to do with their campaigns. And that has been one of the problems. But however big the corruption is in Brazil, apparently it is infinitely worse in Bolivia currently, whatever the ideological nature, and it is an enormous problem in Venezuela also. So it's a general huge problem in the area, I think.
It is true. However, just to point out that the reason why Lula won wasn't because of a good job done. It was really mostly ignorant, low mass, very charismatic, and very appealing for people, that a person that only have 11 years of education is in the government and a lot of marketing going on, especially since his son owns part of one of the major channels in Brazil. So I disagree with you that the fact that he's won the election is a show of the success of his 4 years, of the continuation of the 4 years, and that shows continuity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. Last year I did some work down in Argentina, and I was in Buenos Aires and Santa Fe, and I talked to a lot of the college-age students there, and I was just curious how they felt that Americans viewed them. And many of the students there felt that they were not treated as intellectual equals, but they were kind of patronized, such as some of the quotes that you read there. We kind of have this father-child relationship with them, and how that kind of builds, even though there wasn't very much strong anti-American feelings, they just were kind of disappointed that they couldn't be treated as equals. And I was curious as if, there really is a red wave going on South America as to how what China's image is of South America. Do they treat them as equals and therefore gain respect of South America, or do they also kind of patronize them?
Well, the boom in the Chinese economy has had hugely beneficial effects for South America. It's not had beneficial effects for Mexico, because Mexico has become a huge competitor in cheaper, better produced products into the US market than Mexico. So that's another of the sort of the unintended consequences or the lack of consequences of NAFTA for employment generation in Mexico. But in South America, and this is true with Chile, it's true with Argentina, and it's different commodities. It's true with Brazil. Brazil has a great mix of commodities that it's exporting, agriculture as well as natural resources. Chile, copper. Prices are high because of the demand in China. Beef and all these other exports. Wheat is very important export. Soya, hugely important. Soya is Brazil, I think, has become the largest world exporter now, and China is a very big part of it, mainly for feed, for animal feed, which is changing the diet patterns in China because it's all feeding chickens, and then people are eating chickens more. So it's one of those shifts that's going on. It's difficult to say. The Chinese are very, as you know, inscrutable about what they say. I did. Curiously enough, one of the chapters in my book actually is about Macau, because I wanted to see Macau before it went back to China, so to speak. Macau is this little tiny gambling territory opposite Hong Kong, mouth of the Pearl River, where the Portuguese had been for 500 years almost. And it returned to China just after Hong Kong was returned. So when I was there, I met with the man who now is the chief executive, who was then the banker, who was the leading banker there. And he'd just come back from Brazil. I asked him this question. He'd just come back. And because they want Macau to be the link, the type of Sino, they have a thing called the Sino-Latino Foundation, which is fueled by billions of dollars. If you ever want to run a conference, by the way, on China and Latin America, go to Macau and ask them for money, because they want to stimulate discussions at conference. So I asked him, what did he think about Brazil? He said, well, I don't know. They're a bit disorganized. I mean, maybe it'll take a bit of time for them. And it reminded me of there's that famous phrase that I think de Gaulle asked, or somebody asked, Zhou Enlai, what he thought about the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to say. And there's a slight element. The Chinese have this sense of time that others don't. But the Chinese will never express a feeling of superiority in discussions. They're extremely sensitive to that. And the thing is, there is quite a large Chinese community in Sao Paulo that is quite influential and is a link into this trading patterns. So, but you didn't find any personal hostility yourself in Argentina, did you?
A little bit. In one instance, we had someone actually throw a brick through our bus window, but that was only one person, no one else. I think it was someone that kind of knew we were. For the most part, though, there wasn't anything.
Yeah. Because by and large, from what I gather, people still, and certainly we as professors going are not overtly, there's no overt, I mean, people may say nasty things about us as soon as we left the room, I'm sure they do, but there will be no personal antagonism. There is personal antagonism now in Europe towards Americans to a degree that was not true. I mean, that has been one of the unfortunate consequences of the last 4 years. That's certainly, I'm shocked by that in some cases, but I have never personally found that in Latin America, and certainly students that I know have not found that. So there is an accessibility there, but we shouldn't anticipate that will be there forever if we pursue policies that alienate everybody. There's certainly in polling anti-Americanism has comes up very high in polling, but it comes very low it's usually government. Don't like what the government's doing. But do you like Americans? Yes. Do you want to go to America? Yes. Would you have an American student in your home? Yes. But that's not true everywhere. So I think there is that positive element still there. Yeah.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Yeah, get one more.
We've got one more here and two more here. Is that, and then Professor Maxwell's had a very long day, so
I actually had a quick question on what you see, neoliberalism and globalization and the policies against that and movements against it. If you see that playing a big role in like future trade agreements and policies of the WTO and IMF, if that's going to continue, or if they'll continue in like neoliberalism policies, or if you think that backlash will create a shift in the way that they operate in Latin America in future trade agreements.
Yeah. I think it's dead. No, I think the neoliberal wave, meaning complete opening of markets, has gone. I think that no government is now pursuing that unilaterally in the way in which the Washington Consensus said it should be pursued. The results have not been positive. The public opinion has turned so strongly against those policies in almost every country. It's very difficult for governments to, even if they wanted to, implement it. Brazil is an interesting case because Brazil resisted the more extreme mandates of the IMF in the 1990s. Not necessarily for the best of reasons. Brazil tends to instinctively oppose whatever is suggested to them. There's this mindset that whatever comes from the US or Washington, we oppose at even if 3 days later we accept it. But this led to resistances. There were not privatizations across the board. Petrobras is still a corporation. It runs like a private corporation, but it is still a corporation. And it will not be privatized. Bank of Brazil is still a state bank. So Brazil didn't go the whole route. And social policies and some of the union policies went on. But I think that's one of those waves that has come and gone. That's why I said one of the problems now is finding some way through to a new policies that work and that begin to actually benefit people and to have the patience to pursue them. And that's why despite the discussion, I'm optimistic about Brazil because I think one of the interesting things is there's a strong sense among Brazilians in general that consistent policy, you have to pursue consistent policies, not magic solutions. The problem with Chavez or Baby and Morales and so on is that you can overnight change 500 years of inequality. You can't. It would be nice. A lightning bolt came and you could do it, but that isn't the way it works. It tends to lead to a disintegration of society. So Latin America is tremendously lacking in solid political institutions that deliver. That is one of the great problems, I think. So I think it's a question mark, but I don't think it'll go back to the type of Washington Consensus policies of the 1990s. I think those are generally seen either to have failed or to have need of modification. Even the progenitors of that policy believe that.
The second one is about using the name Caudillo to describe Hugo Chavez, who's faced several elections and won by an overwhelming majority each time in highly democratic elections.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, he's an elected caudillo. I mean, that can happen. Perón was elected. I mean, actually Hitler was elected. We forget, but I'm not comparing him to that. But I mean, I think that what I'm talking about is the behavior pattern and government policies that it seems to me to be classic, top-down, charismatic leader, populist, distributist policies. I mean, that is in effect what he's doing. And the reason he can do it is he has means to do it. And he's doing it with benefits. I mean, people are benefiting, there's no question. The question is it sustainable? Is it structurally changing? Is Venezuelan society changing in a way that will make this sustainable if you don't have massive rises all the time in oil prices? So I think that's the thing. The coup, but of course he made coups himself. You know, I mean, there are two sides to that. You know, he failed twice as a coup maker himself. And I think one needs to remember that. I think that taught him many lessons and helped him when the coup was made against himself. Yeah, you're right. But I was thinking of this year when you've had elections. The general pattern is change of governments by elections, and in most cases, recognition of the results. We haven't talked about Mexico, of course, which is is a hugely problematic situation where you have an election that produced a result rather like the U.S. election, result with Bush 1 and not Bush 1. I mean the first Bush period with Gore, without accepting the legitimacy of it by the opposition candidate. So I think that is a extreme instability potential for the future, for the next several months. And as far as I can see, again, I haven't seen all the names, but the general impression of the cabinet that Calderon has pointed is that it's somewhat of the right of the PAN, of the Conservative Party. So it's not a very representative cabinet, even of the PAN. And the government is going to be extremely dependent on PRI, the old party that ran Mexico for decades, to get anything through Congress and to function in the country because of the nature of the governorships that PRI go. So Mexico, we should have talked more about Mexico, actually. I mean, Mexico is a big question mark. And the nature of the institutions, of the institutional decline, the role of gangs, the role of narco-trafficking, the role of corruption, the role of migration, immigration, the lack of, development that will keep people from migrating. These are huge problems. They all fit within that problem. Yeah, it's a very, very good point. I agree.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good.
My question is about Venezuela too, and because of the last election, actually, through recent, you started talking about how Latin America has democracy, most of it. Do you think that the way Chavez, although the people elected him, like majority, like 60% or something, do you think it's a democracy, or to what extent is a democracy if people were afraid of not voting him, or he just give the other parties less time for having a campaign on TV? Do you think that's still democracy?
I mean, there's a very interesting general point to make, and that is that when this whole democratization movement was taking place in Latin America and elsewhere, I mean, a lot of this began in Southern Europe in the 1970s with Greece and Spain and Portugal. The U.S., as it involved itself in these movements, very much defined democracy as electoral democracy, and that was reinforced by people from all sectors. I mean, Jimmy Carter and his democracy monitoring to the U.S. government itself, and so it narrowed in a sense of how you define democracy. Democracy was if you had an election with a majority result. And as we know, actually, there are more complexities to that. It's how the votes get done, it's how the parties are organized, it's all these things, part of the sinews that make for a functioning democratic society. The problem in Latin America is you've had elections, And I think I don't think there's much question that he was elected by majority. I mean, I think 61 or whatever. I think that's the case. The question is what impediments are in the way to that exercise of the suffrage. And the real problem, I think, is what I said before, is the lack of the deterioration and in many ways the absence of the intermediary organizations that make a functioning democracy work, that is parliaments or the everyday management of affairs by committees in Congress that can investigate. I mean, all these elements that have simply disappeared in many, or did not exist, or don't exist in many Latin American countries. So just having an election, and then thinking everything is resolved, which tended to be the attitude. You have an election, it's fair or it isn't, then you go away, is not necessarily lead to civility of democratic life, if that's what you're. So I think that's right. That's a big. Put your finger on really one of the fundamental issues. I think the problems with Latin America is the lack of these institutional mechanisms to make day-to-day democracy work. Yeah. But I don't think. I mean, just to say, but I don't think you can deny that Chavez has legitimacy in an electoral sense. He clearly has that. Yeah. Thanks.
Please join me in thanking Professor Maxwell. It was most edifying for me, and I'm sure for everyone else.
Thanks.